Hi everyone.
Hi.
How's everybody feeling today? It's good to hear. I'd like to start with a power clap. So I'm just going to count to 3 and then we're going to all clap together. 1, 2, 3. Nice. Felt good. I've really been looking forward to sharing this with you guys today because it's something I've really enjoyed looking into and reading about in the last few years. And I think it's really helped me see my place in activism better and also be more effective activist. So hopefully it can do that for you guys too. I guess I could start with posing the question, why psychology? I'm trying to answer the question, why am I interested in psychology? And I'd like to explain that with an analogy. And that is, if you want to do some engineering, you need to understand the materials you're working with, their strengths, their weaknesses, how they act under stress and that kind of thing. And similarly, if you want to do social engineering, you have to understand what you're working with, people, how they act under stress, their strengths and weaknesses and that kind of thing. So that's why. A disclaimer, in an ideal world, in my view, a lot of the techniques that I'm about to tell you today wouldn't work. So just keep that in mind. A lot of what I talk about today comes out of this book, Change of Heart by Nick Cooney. And this book kind of sums up a lot of psychological research from the past, I guess the past forever, and puts it in a really good and digestible way. I can really recommend it. And I can also say that the presentation today, I've got some really good notes for it, and I'm happy to send them out to anyone. So you don't have to stress too much about taking notes, although that does help to digest at the time. But that's my email. So if you shoot me an email, I'll send you the notes from the book and from this presentation. So this is kind of the format today. And I guess I've tried to make it follow the format of our engagement with people as activists. So first we can have a look at ourselves, maybe what brought us to activism, and then we can think about gaining attention and making impressions, which is kind of like the front line, the first time you get to engage with someone. Then we look at shifting opinions, which is often thought as the next thing. So you engage with someone, you can change their mind, and then you can change their behaviours. I'm going to expand on that relationship a little bit more later. Something we all have to do at some point is getting money, so I'll touch on that. And then we'll close up with living change. So looking inward, I'm going to start with a little conversation. So you can just turn to the person next to you and explain to them in 20 seconds which issue you feel most strongly about. So go. Now I'd like you to think about why is that the issue that you care about the most? And so have a chat to the person next to you about that. So Nick outlines 2 major ways that people come to activism or to issues. Type A is through contemplation and reflection, you came upon the conclusion that the way the world works could be improved upon, and you set about to do just that. And the other way, the primary way, is personal circumstantial reasons led you to do the type of work you do. The issue is interesting to you, the issue affects you and your loved ones personally, your friends are involved in this type of work, you've been hearing about it a lot in the media, etc. So who thinks they're more type 1? Cool. Yeah, okay. And the second, just on the issue you feel strongly about. And the second one? Great. Cool. So we kind of explored that. Welcome guys, come on in. No worries. I was keen to explore that because it's important to think about where we're coming from and our starting points. I know that I in the past have had a tendency to be confused about why other people don't care about my issue as much as I do. And so I've found kind of thinking about it in that way really helpful to help me engage more openly with people on issues. That's linked to another thing called availability bias, which is a tendency for us to believe that the things we hear about more often are more important. So this is something like, maybe in Australia, Australians would give a lot of money to cancer charities. Maybe more lives would be saved if those people gave their money to malaria charities. But they don't see malaria as a problem, and that's because we probably see cancer more often in our society. That's availability bias. So now we've talked about what we care about the most. I'd like to open the question to you to have a chat again about how do you measure your impact on that issue? What is your bottom line? Go. Did anyone want to share their bottom line, how they measure their impact? Yep.
I guess one that we have in common was personal fulfillment.
Okay, great. Anyone else?
Millions of tons of CO2 avoided.
Nice. Nice. Now, I ask this question because often we have to make decisions between taking one action and another. And if we haven't really thought about how we're measuring our impact, it can be really hard to try to determine which path is more clear or which path is going to have a greater effect. I don't have any complete answers for this, but I just wanted to point out it's something it's good to think about. And I personally find that question a lot harder to answer than the first two ones that I asked. Why don't others care? I just wanted to touch on this before we move on. They can use things like diversion strategies. This is like you spending a little bit more time on YouTube than you should when you should be doing your assignment. Adoption of empathy. This is maybe they don't take the time to kind of actually think about the way this affects other people. Blame the victim. Often we blame the victim, this happens a lot in rape cases. People say, it was her fault because of this or that or whatever, and that is used by people as a justification for not acting on issues that should be acted on, and then it gets smaller because I wanted to move on. Okay, gaining attention and making impressions. First thing is break a pattern. First thing is break a pattern. First thing is break a pattern. 181. First thing is break a pattern. So breaking a pattern is a really effective way of gaining attention. This is the idea behind things like flash mobs, banner drops. Someone might be handing out flyers and they might be making that funny clicky sound. You're walking down the street, you hear it, what's that? They give you a flyer. So think about that. Think about breaking a pattern when you're trying to engage people. Often say it. So obviously saying something often means people hear it more often, but there's actually some interesting points that we maybe wouldn't expect. One of them is hearing something from the same source heaps of times is almost as effective as hearing it from multiple sources that same number of times. So if you can be really pig-headed about some issue sometimes and get the word out, this is like Tony Abbott, like saying the same thing over again. It's like really boring, but actually it starts to sink in after a while, which is sad but true. Also, the more often someone hears something, the more likely they are to attribute it to a reliable source. So again, related to the value of saying something often. And then finally, if the majority doesn't have a strong opinion on an issue, a small minority can make it appear as though the majority has a strong opinion just by being really loud. So say it often. Priming. Priming is setting up a situation for a certain kind of an outcome. So, or to give off a certain feeling. So you might walk into a meeting with a briefcase. That sends a message straight away like, I mean business. Someone might come into your house. You might offer them a cup of tea. We associate warmth with comfort. So that might be saying, hey, I'm trying to comfort you. This is priming. And today I said, I'm really looking forward to sharing some of this stuff with you guys. That was a priming to say, I want to share this stuff. It's going to be great. Hopefully that got you all excited. Stories. Now, stories are really effective, and they're something that often social movements like the AYCC, Oak Tree, spend a lot of time on storytelling. So I won't spend a lot of time on it, only to say that an effective story is more important than the fluency of a speaker. This was showed last year at SOS, where we had some stories from some refugees that had really broken English, but it was still such a powerful session just because of the power of their stories. So don't forget that. Attitude. Now, attitude is super important when engaging people. This is for a few reasons. First, friendliness is one of the most important determinants of persuasiveness. Secondly, if we make it look like it's fun to save the world, other people are going to want to join us. And another thing is to ensure that you're kind of starting things out with the correct attitude, a really great question to use in a meeting or in a conversation or that kind of thing is, how are you feeling? It gives the other person time to speak, and it also allows you to actually gauge how they're feeling so you can approach them with an appropriate attitude. You might remember at the start of today's presentation, I asked everyone, how are you feeling? Now, names. Names are really important. We know it feels great when someone remembers our name. We know it's important to remember other people's names, even though we might not do it as much as we should. But a crazy thing about names is that a requestee is more likely to perform perform a request if the requester has a similar sounding name.
No.
So, you know, if Chloe Snow is trying to get Joe Blow to have a go, she stands a much better chance than if John Smith is trying to get Joe Blow to have a go. So if there's someone in your collective who has a similar name to the politician you're trying to lobby, send them to do the lobbying. Or just change your name or whatever. Another thing is that we link fluidity to accuracy. So names that, campaign names that rhyme or sound familiar are much more likely to be remembered. And also, if you're trying to, I remember my mate Steve at school used to say, if it rhymes, it must be true, which I always thought was a stupid thing to say until I read this book and I said, oh, we actually think that. Okay, knowledge gaps. Who knows what a knowledge gap is? You should all know because it's really important. Okay, that was a rhetorical question. Because what I was doing was creating a knowledge gap. So hopefully, after I asked that question, you all went, well, apart from the people who knew what it was, you went, oh, I don't know what that is. I better listen harder. So that's a really powerful tool for engagement. And it's something I used in the blurb for this workshop. I just posed a few questions like, should you use fear as a motivator? Things like that. And hopefully that made you go, hold on, I don't actually know what the right answer to that is. And that's why lots of people came. Yay. Taps, tunes, and anthems. So this story comes from an experiment. The experiment was people were put in pairs when they came into the laboratory, and then we got to like tap out some tune or whatever in sync with each other. After that activity, one of them was accused by the person running the experiment that they had cheated somehow. But then the experimenter said, but that's okay, you can rectify the situation by doing this weird puzzle. Okay, sounds really weird, but then the person who wasn't accused of cheating was told, oh, and you can help them do the puzzle as well. So that was the experimenter group. The control group, everything was exactly the same, except instead of tapping in time, they were told to tap out of time, or they were given a rhythm that didn't actually really work. And the thing that was measured was the time spent working together on the problem at the end. Now, the team who were told to tap out of time, the person who wasn't accused of cheating helped the other person approximately for 1 minute on average. And when they tapped together, the average was 7 minutes. So simply just doing an activity together, like doing a clap together at the start of this presentation, can make people feel, much more together and can really build that kind of sense of community. So think about the things you can do together, songs you can share, things like that when you're trying to build community. Shifting opinions. Traditionally what we think comes after gaining attention or making impressions. But maybe that isn't the case, and that's related to a thing called cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is the feeling that we get when our values don't necessarily match our actions. It's kind of that feeling, when it doesn't quite feel right. And so we don't like that feeling. We feel like there's a need to do something to change it. But the question is, what's easier to do? Change your behaviour or change your opinion? The answer is it's much easier to change your mind, Just change your mind, change your opinion. So often it's actually more effective to try to get someone to take action rather than getting them to change their mind because their opinion will follow their actions. Framing. Framing's an interesting concept. It's kind of what's used with the good cop, bad cop thing. A good way to explain it would be to say, I don't know if Adrian's in the room, but Adrian Whitehead started a party called the Save the Planet Party, right? So before the Save the Planet Party came around, we would have talked about Liberal here, Labor here, and Greens here in terms of the climate change political spectrum. So we'd say, Labor's in the middle. Save the Planet Party comes in, and they're really pushing for climate change and strong action. They've just shifted the political spectrum. They've changed the frame of reference, and suddenly the Greens and Labor are straddling the middle. So that's the effective framing. Another thing is, there might be forest ferals chaining themselves to trees or doing lock-ons and that kind of a thing, and that changes the spectrum for the community. And they say, and suddenly the activist who might be lobbying politicians or something seems more reasonable than they did before, simply because people are taking more drastic action. So it's always important to think about framing. The rule of reciprocity. So this one is essentially, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. An interesting thing is that it also applies to opinions and to conversations. So if you let someone convince you on a smaller point, you might be they're more likely to let you convince them on a larger point or on another point later on. So that's a good thing to let people believe, or to just let them convince you on a smaller point. Another thing about that is that with favours, cash in quickly, because people forget that they owe you. Might sound obvious. Ears are greater than money. So this is related to the fact that speaking about ourselves, our ideas, our opinions, actually it stimulates the same parts of the brain as food and money. And in the experiment that showed this, it was actually shown that people were willing to forego money in order to talk about themselves for a bit longer. So, have you ever walked away from a conversation and thought, gee, that was such a nice person. I don't know if they said anything, though. It's because they were just listening and making you feel good because you were talking about yourself. So, yeah, it's important to listen to other people to make them feel good about themselves as well. Assimilation. Assimilation is really important. What was I going to say? We're more likely to believe someone or feel camaraderie with them if they walk, talk, or even gesticulate in the same way. So you can often watch people from afar, and one person will cross their arm, shortly after the other person will cross their arms. Then they'll kind of change their pose, and then shortly after the other person will change their pose. Yeah, and you can see who's a bit more dominant in the situation because they're probably leading their gesticulations. And another thing that you can do with these is you can use it, like if you're lobbying a politician or something, you might want to search up what their favourite football team is or something like that, and you can kind of assimilate and pretend, wear a footy scarf or something like that. Probably not appropriate. But talk about that kind of thing and show that you've got something in common. This is related to what Libby was saying yesterday in plenary about we have to look at what's common between us rather than what's different, and build that pool of common meaning from which you can, expand your conversation and work together. Tribalism. We're all humans, we come from tribes, and we all feel this. We all have a sense of us and them. But sometimes when we're doing activism, it's necessary to break down these kind of us and them boundaries. Two ways to do that is to, one, conceptualise yourselves both, or get two different parties to conceptualise themselves as part of a bigger group. A film that does this really well is Earthlings, which is about animal rights. And it says, it's not us humans and those animals, we're actually all Earthlings. It's a really strong approach. Another way is through adoption of empathy. So trying to get each party to see things from the point of view of the other side. Objective outlining. So the question here is, if you're going to make a point, is it better to make the point first, then give your reasons, or first give your reasons and then come to the conclusion? Who thinks it's the first one? Who thinks it's the second one? Okay, everybody's right. Whee. It actually depends on the scenario. So if you think your audience is going to agree with you, you're better off outlining your conclusion and then giving the backup. Because then they go, okay, yep, I agree with this person. Now I'm going to pay heaps of attention to their argument so I can reproduce it later. If you think they're going to disagree with you, then you want to come to your conclusion at the end, or maybe not even explicitly say it at all and let them come to it. Because if you outline your objective or your conclusion at the start, then they go, I disagree with this person, and they're just going to be making arguments in their head against everything you say from then on. Confirmation bias. So I noticed this in myself when my parents bought a new car. They bought a VW Golf, and the next day I was like, man, there's so many VW Golfs around these days. Between the time that my parents hadn't bought the car and when they had bought it, the number of Golfs on the road obviously didn't change that much. But my idea of how many Golfs were on the road had changed, and therefore I started to notice things that backed up my conclusion. This is part of the reason why climate denialism can be so prevalent, because those who deny it manage to only take notice of the facts, or not that they're facts, but the information that backs up their conclusion. So we have to try to always approach issues with an open mind and always being aware that confirmation bias could be affecting us. No agenda. It's really useful sometimes to present on an issue as if you don't care about it. Why? Because if someone sees you really passionate about something, they think you've got an ulterior motive or something like that, and they can find your argument to be less convincing. However, if you just stand up there and you're a scientist and you say, if CO2 reaches 350 ppm, we have a 50% chance of getting 2 degrees climate change, and then this will cause this effect, this effect, this effect. They're like, oh, well, that guy doesn't care, and he's still saying it, so it must be true. So it's important to think about agenda. Okay, ego. Ego can often get in the way of both ourselves communicating well and other people communicating well. A few things you can do to get around that. One thing is, if you're in a meeting and you think you've clearly outlined your points, but you don't feel like the other party is coming to the conclusion or stating the conclusion that you think they should be, it can be helpful to say something like, I think I've clearly communicated what I wanted to say. I'll leave the decision with you. What that does is it gives the other party the opportunity to go away and then to come back to you and say, I've thought about it and I've decided that this is what should happen. And often it can be a lot more effective than keeping on pushing for a decision in that meeting. So we can keep that in mind. Another thing is people often find it easier to be convinced by something that is in written form by someone who they don't know than if it's told to them. An example of this was I went to a conference with my friend Patrick. I'd been talking to Patrick about veganism for quite some time, but he was always like, oh no, I could never give up cheese. Then we went to this conference, there was a Why Vegan pamphlet on his chair, and he sat down and we were in a presentation, he kind of flicking through it during the presentation. At the end of the presentation, we stand up to go out and he turns to me and says, Ollie, I'm going to go vegan now. And I go, oh, why is that, Patrick? Why now? I've been telling you about all these issues, and why the pamphlet? It's like, no, Ollie, it wasn't you, it was the pamphlet. And so I thought that was a great example of that. Another thing is it's really important not to point out hypocrisy in people. It just never goes down well. So try to avoid it and try to just provide them with the correct information. Don't deny it. So I guess you might be in an interview or something and someone might say, but isn't it true that some of the global warming is due to sunspots or something like that? What you want to do is just assert the correct information. Well, actually, global warming is primarily and overwhelmingly due to anthropogenic CO2 emissions. Why is that? It's because if you repeat their sentence, you're actually giving the audience a chance to hear that point again. Even though you preface it with no, they still hear what you say. So this is related to the often hear it before. So don't deny it, just insert the correct information here. This is also important to think about when you might be doing an informational pamphlet. Often the format is true or false, blah, 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 false or true. These are really good for short-term comprehension. If you test the person an hour later, maybe even a day later, their comprehension of the information can be really accurate. But if you test them in, say, a month or so, what tends to happen is their opinion or their belief reverts back to the original opinion, but they're even more sure about it because they know they read a pamphlet on it. So true or false isn't a very good way of communicating information. Guilt. Is guilt a good way to get people to engage with an issue? No, just don't do it. The more you try to use guilt, persuasiveness drops. So keep that in mind. Message discrepancy. So this is about finding the balance between asking someone to make a change that's possible and asking someone to make a change that's appropriate. This is a challenge we're always facing in activism. Perhaps it's best for the wood chopper who chops down 100 trees to stop chopping down all trees, but perhaps he's only going to make it. But if you ask him to stop cutting down all his trees, he's not going to make any change at all. But if you ask him to cut down 90 instead of 100, he might actually make a difference. So this is just something to keep in mind when we're trying to find that balance. Psychological reactance. We're a bit short of time, so I'm going to skip over that point. Okay, what happened when I said that? Did you want to hear about that point more? Okay, so that's what psychological reactance is. Okay? It's the tendency for us to value information more when it's withheld from us. So if you're running a workshop or something like that, and someone asks a question, and you really, you just hate what they say, or it's just completely unhelpful, if you brush over it, or, brush it under the mat, the audience will have a feeling like, hold on, like, I think that person should be heard. They must have had something really valuable to say. So it's actually important to, address it, give it the time that's required, and then move on. Psychological reactance. The recency effect. This is the tendency of our brains to unconsciously weight information that we've heard recently over information that we've heard in the past. So if you're maybe in charge of awarding grant applications or scholarships, just keep in mind that you're more likely to award it to people those applications you've read more recently than in the past. So you're more likely to remember the good points from the ones you've read recently than the past. This actually came up for me in a decision that happened over the last few days. There was a consensus decision-making process, and a couple of relatively outspoken people spoke for one side of the argument towards the end of the debate. And I think that probably meant that there wasn't... We ended up going with the decision of those people, which was also supported by some but not all. But the other side of the argument was represented more at the start of that consensus as we went around the circle. And I feel that I should have been more aware in that scenario of the recency effect and the fact that my brain was weighting the arguments of those who spoke last, and I had kind of already forgotten about those who spoke first. So it's a really important thing to remember. And minority influence. This is just a sentence that kind of sums up a lot of this stuff from this particular section. A minority opinion is more likely to be accepted if the group has a consistent behavioural style, when the message can't be attributed to self-interest, when they agree with a majority on a side point, when the message is relevant to them, when you cause the listener to be less confident about their own knowledge on the issue, when you point out similarities between you and them, or surprise them by agreeing with them on issues that they don't expect you to agree with them on. Or, finally, by pointing out that their view is shared with people with whom they would not like to be associated. Yes?
Do you think that is something that might have been driving Clive Palmer's recent acceptance of anthropogenic climate change in surprising people by agreeing with people that he's normally in opposition with, and maybe winning over people who, or opening, like, do you see that?
So I've missed your point.
Do you know Clive Palmer's recent?
Yeah, with Al Gore and stuff.
So yeah, exactly. And so here it says surprising people by agreeing with them on issues that they don't expect you to agree with them on.
Okay.
I'm just wondering if you think that's a psychological, like if that's
A tactic for him.
Yeah, if this is
Yeah.
his tactic.
Yeah, possibly, because, and then he's doing that in order to convince us of something more to his benefit later on, like he believes in climate change, but he still thinks he can, dig up the Galilee Basin or something like that. Yeah, possibly. Alan.
Can I actually kind of ask that question? My understanding is Al Gore really, in his conversations with Palmer, he actually touched on what Palmer cared about. In particular, he focused on the conversation on Palmer's children and his children's futures, and connected with Palmer in that sense, and actually sort of brought empathy into it. I had a point about relating that to what you've got on the slide there, but I think I've forgotten.
Great.
Probably elaborate.
So that'd be related to that point I was talking about in terms of assimilation. So you're finding out the football teams they like, finding out the names of their kids and what their kids' hobbies are and those kinds of things. Awesome. Change behaviours. A few things to think about when we're trying to get people to change their behaviours. First off, is it a big or a little deal? is if it's a big change for them, it's more likely they'll go through an actual analytical process to make that decision. If it's a small deal, they're more likely to go through an emotional process to make that decision. So that's one point. Making the ask. What was I going to say here? One of the biggest barriers to action for people is whether or not they can see themselves actually doing the action. If you get someone to voluntarily say that they'll do it, that action of just saying they're going to do it is that actually increases their probability of doing the action. But conversely, if you ask them to do it and then they say they won't do it, that decreases their chance of doing the action. And finally, don't ask them too many times because that'll really decrease their chance. Like you can imagine if every time you see a girl, you ask her if she's going to the dance on Saturday night, she's probably not going to go. Narrow their options. Okay, this one can be related to dating as well. If you go up to someone and say, hey, how would you like to go to a movie or go on a walk or go to the theatre or go to a concert or come for dinner with my parents? It doesn't really work. Yeah, so it's better you, me, Saturday night. Yeah. Another thing to think about is homework. So say you've got a big assignment to write, but your favourite band's in town. It's quite likely you might want to go to see your favourite band. But if you've got an assignment to write and your two favourite bands are in town and you can only see one of them, your brain goes, well, I already have to miss one of them, so I may as well just do my assignment, right? So sometimes narrowing the options can really influence people changing behaviours and taking those actions. Foot in the door. This is a good way of getting people engaged. The story that Nick Cooney in his book talks about is they wanted people to put big signs in their yard, or this experiment tried to get people to put big signs in their yard. Say they said, I can't recall what the sign said, but say it was like, watch out for wildlife or something. So they went to one street and they gave them these signs and they said, hey, can you put this massive sign in your yard? And the people were like, no way, that's crazy. They went to another street and they started off with stickers. And they said, hey, could you put this sticker somewhere in your house that it's visible from the street? They got a reasonable amount of uptake. Quite a few people said, yeah, I guess I can do that. A week later, they went back with the signs and they said, hey, can you put this massive sign in your yard? And they said, well, actually, I'm the kind of person who cares about animals. See the sticker? Yeah, sure, I'll put the sign in my yard. So that's the foot in the door technique. It's about engaging someone first with a little step and then ramping it up a little bit later. So door in the face is opposite to foot in the door. Door in the face is making... door in the face, and there's another one like door in the face, foot in the door in the face, or something. It's like really complicated, but I haven't quite got my head around that one yet. Door in the face is the opposite to foot in the door. It's basically asking someone to do something that you don't expect them to actually do. So this is like going to them and saying, hey, can you do a banner drop from your gutter about wildlife? And you know they're not going to do it, but then a week later you come back and you say, oh, I know you didn't want to do the banner drop, but maybe you want to put this sign in your yard. And they kind of go, well, I already said no to this guy. I better say yes this time. So it actually can be quite an effective technique. Something to keep in mind with door in the face, if you're trying to use it, is you have to get the same person to make the request both times. If the second request comes from someone else, it doesn't work. Using fear. Should you use fear to try to get people to change their behaviours? Yes, but. And the but is if the action is clear. So it's really good that cigarette ads use fear, cancer, big graphic images and stuff, because the action is really obvious. Just stop smoking cigarettes, right? It's the same with driving. Driving ads use fear because it's pretty obvious what you do. Just drive more safely, pay more attention, go a bit slower. But for issues like climate change, if we've got a documentary that shows someone some really scary thing about climate change, it's not really all that clear what we should do, especially as an individual. So that can actually just create a cognitive dissonance, as I was talking before, where they're like, well, this is an issue that I should do heaps about, but I'm not doing much. Oh, something has to change. Oh, it mustn't be such a big issue after all, So, yeah, that's what to think about when using fear. Okay, that's interesting. So maybe that suggests that it isn't as effective with cigarettes and driving because it only works for a little while. And I know that I've spoken to smokers and they're like, yeah, you just stop noticing the pictures after a while. Yeah. So, yeah, great point. Cool. Feedback. So this is relevant if you're like running a team or maybe you're a parent or something like that. And it's kind of like the kind of feedback you should be giving. If you tell your kid that they're really smart, then they can have a thought like, well, wow, I'm really smart. I get praise for being smart, and no matter what I do, I'll be smart. Therefore, no matter what I do, I'll get praise. And they can actually start being quite lazy. Whereas if you say, wow, great job, you worked really hard, excellent effort, then they'll say, oh, I get praise for working hard and putting in effort, therefore I should work hard and put in more effort so I get more praise. So it's quite valuable to praise for effort rather than innate abilities. Yeah, that's right. That's actually also, there was a study called Pygmalion in the Classroom, where the experimenters came into a classroom and they told a teacher that a few of the students were gifted. They did some testing and then they chose students across the whole spectrum and told the teacher that those students were gifted, and then tracked those students' progress over the year. And the students they told the teacher were gifted, even though they weren't, became gifted because the teacher was treating them differently, and because the kids had a different self-concept of themselves. So yeah, it's very true. It can have a big effect. Prompts. Just a quick thing. Prompts are, if you want someone to put their butt in the bin or something like that, just put prompts as close in time and space to the action as you possibly can. Eyes and mirrors. This is a type of prompt. So say you've got an honesty system, like you're trying to sell some chocolates or something like that, but you can't always be there to attend to stuff. What you can do is you can put a picture of some eyes on there, or you can put a mirror on there. So what eyes does is people, as they're going to maybe think about stealing the money that's there, they have a feeling as though they're being watched, and so they're less likely to do it. And a mirror, as they're walking up, they see themselves, and then they have to question, well, am I really the kind of person who steals stuff? So eyes and mirrors can work. I guess so, they're the same thing, yeah. Spillovers. So this is finally, when we're changing behaviours, we have to think about spillovers. So, if your goal is to reduce, tons of CO2 emitted, and you aim to do that by helping people install solar panels, but you tell them to install the solar panels because it's going to save them money, what might happen is they save money and then they spend that money on an overseas holiday, and overall you get a spillover effect and you get more CO2 released into the atmosphere. So we've got to keep spillovers in mind. I don't know. Try to think ahead, plan for contingencies and that kind of thing. But yeah, I guess it's also related to shifting values and shifting opinions. And so if you try to motivate them by the monetary thing, then they're more likely to spend on a holiday. If you try to motivate them by shifting their opinions about climate change is actually a big deal, maybe they'll decide to have a local holiday instead or something like that. Getting money, a good thing to say is anything helps. It helps increase people giving money. Related to these next 2 points, I used to run a documentary evening every week, and it was like a fundraiser as well. And I noticed a big difference between when I showed emotive films, which people would just be crying money at me, versus analytical films that were kind of like about critiques and that kind of thing. So it really made sense to me when I read this book, and it kind of explained how engaging the emotional side of people is a great thing to do before you ask them for money, because they'll be more generous. Whereas if you engage the analytical parts of the brain through critique and that kind of a thing before you ask them for money, you find when you ask for money, they'll start asking questions like, how's the money being spent? Are you sure this charity is the most effective one? Things like that. So if you're doing crowdfunding campaign or something like that, don't necessarily bring the facts and figures into it. Just tell a good story. State your target, really clear. Just, if you want to make a certain amount of money, say it, and then have one of those little bars that tops up and people can see how much you're getting to. And that can help people be more generous. And finally, anchors. So I want everyone to think of a number between 0 and 200. Okay, cool. It didn't work as well as I hoped, but you said 181. You're just helping me out. Thanks. The idea was, before when I broke a pattern, I said 181. So the idea was that acted as an anchor. So maybe that was too long ago though, but that was an anchor in people's mind. So when you say randomly select a number from 0 to 200, they use that anchor and they'll go around it. It worked really well when I did this presentation once. Everything was like between 170 and 200, but since then it hasn't really worked. But we can use this like if you're trying to get someone to fill out a donation form or something, and you want them to donate $25. There might be you might be able to place a 25 somewhere close to the like how much would you like to donate thing, or you might like make it on page 25 of the document or something like that. And because people are always looking for references to make decisions. I think it would work overtly as well. And I think also, if we were to say, how many jelly beans are in the jar, and then we have everyone's guesses listed and visible, that's going to definitely change the way that the following people guess it. And actually, this happened in terms of I think measuring the charge of an electron, right? So the first person who measured the charge of an electron got it pretty wrong, and then it took a lot of time. Over time, if you look at the results. If you look at the results, it's like, this is time and this is the charge. We're here and it kind of goes like this. And then suddenly someone measures it right and they actually have the balls to publish the proper results. And it goes here and then it's like this. So, all these people using the previous results as anchors, but that was just the wrong thing to do and bad science. Finally, living change. So, one question is, why should we live the change? Why should we let our lives speak? A good answer to this that I've found is degrees of influence. So Homer Simpson is a fat guy, right? That has a really interesting effect. Homer being fat compared to Homer being skinny or normal size or whatever means that his friends are automatically 57% more likely to be fat. His friends of friends are automatically 20% more likely to be fat. And his friends of friends of friends are automatically 10% more likely to be fat. Now, this is accounting for homophily, which is the tendency of like people to associate with like people. And the study that I was reading about specifically related to obesity, which is why I talk about Homer being fat. This does work for other things. Obviously, the numbers would be different. But I like to think that, me trying to be conscious about the things that I eat means that my friends are more likely to be, and their friends of friends, and their friends of friends of friends. So that's one example of why it's important to live change. How do we live the change? How can we live the change? What devices can we use to help us live the way that we want to live? One way is to make a commitment. So say to your friends, you may remember me speaking before how about if you say you're going to do something, it makes you more likely to do it. So if you say it, so you can harness that for your own benefit. Say you're going to do it, it'll make you more likely to do it. Also, it means your friends can hold you to account. Yep. Yeah, we do have to be careful there, because if you get congratulated for making the decision and not for the action, then that can, that's true. For example, with this presentation, I read the book and then I told a friend, I've read this amazing book, I'm going to turn it into a presentation, it's going to be great. A couple of months went by, uni started, didn't really get around to it. Bumped into her later at a breakfast. She was like, how'd that presentation go? I said, yeah, I didn't really get around to it. I'll do it on the weekend. And so I went home and did it on the weekend, so it was really helpful. Cool. Another good thing to do is to make a plan. As I mentioned before, one of the biggest barriers to action is you can't see yourself doing something. So if you can make a plan, break it down into steps, each of which you can see yourself acting upon, that can be really clear. A really good version of making plans is if you make if-then plans. So if this happens, then I'll do this. For example, if you want to quit swearing, instead of just saying, I'm going to quit swearing from now on, say, if I feel like I want to swear, I'm going to say bugger. And then you've actually given yourself to do something in replacement. If they're in command, you can implement the plan. Mental rehearsal. Now, mental rehearsal, the interesting thing about this is it can actually be up to 2/3 as effective as doing the physical action. For things like giving speeches, it can be even more effective than 2/3 as effective as saying it out loud. So, for example, to preserve my voice today, when I was thinking about doing this presentation beforehand, I didn't always speak. I could just go through it in my head. You know, if you're preparing for an exam, you don't have to rewrite your notes. You just have to re-recall your notes. And this is also why I think about working out for half an hour every day. Now, friends, this is related to the degrees of influence that I was talking about before. Obviously, it goes the other way. So if you have influences on your friends, they have influences on you. Consciously choose the kind of people you want to associate with, and that'll shape you. It's also related to the kind of things you watch. You know, if you watch reality TV shows where people are really bitchy to each other, then you're reinforcing those neurological pathways to engage with other people in those ways. So if you don't want to engage with other people in those ways, don't watch crappy TV. And remember sustainability. So, hindsight bias. Basically, we have a real tendency to forget what it was like to not know a piece of information. This is why teachers can be really bad sometimes, because they forget what it was like to not understand the thing they're teaching you, and they treat you as an idiot, as though you're an idiot, even though it actually took them ages to learn it as well. And the reason why I talk about hindsight bias in terms of sustainability and looking after ourselves is because sometimes we have a tendency to blame ourselves after a decision or after something's happened because we have the knowledge of what the outcome was, right? And it seems obvious to us after the fact that what we did maybe wasn't the best course of action. But we've got to keep in mind what it was like to actually be in that decision-making position before it happened and the information that was available to us at the time. So what I'm saying is don't blame yourself too much. Or other people, yeah, that's right. And focus on the process that you went through at the time and try to make sure that's really valuable or a good one. Impact bias. So if I was to ask you, if today one of two things happened to you, either you won the lottery or became a paraplegic, which of these do you think would make you happier in a year?
Lottery.
Yeah, exactly. That seems like a pretty obvious conclusion, right? Well, turns out there's no statistically significant difference between happiness outcomes between these two parties, right? A guy called Dan Gilbert has done a lot of research on this. He researches happiness, and he found that a year after the action, paraplegics and lottery winners, their happiness has changed by not a significant amount. That's impact bias. It's our tendency to believe that an outcome will have a bigger effect than it actually does. I guess this stuff for me has helped me to become more comfortable in the way that I engage with activism, especially one thing, which is the tension between framing, so taking drastic action as I was talking about before, and message discrepancy, right? So actually asking for a change that's realistic or possible. And it's made me realise that we actually need all types of people to engage in all of these issues. We need people who are pushing the boundaries and people who are changing the framing around which society sees things. And we also need people to sit in the middle, to be engaging with those people who otherwise wouldn't be engaged by the people who are on the extremities. So for me, that's really been one of the main things that that's come out of this for me. So hopefully you enjoy the presentation. Thank you.